This is Clark the Knife, and this is going to be a quick review, an overview of some knife scales. These are Flytanium's Benchmade Bugout scales. And these here are in titanium in their two-tone andization pattern. This is their Neptune pattern. And so this is not going to be a full review. I've got my full Bugout review, and this is still very much a Bugout. What I'm going to talk about is sort of the overall value proposition of these scales, what I like about them, what I don't like about them, and whether I recommend them. I'm not going to do a formal scoring system or anything like that, so this will just be a bit more of a general overview and give you hopefully some of my thoughts on why these might or might not be worth it for you. So let's get into it. First off, these scales, just for comparison, here is your Flytanium, and here's a basic Bugout. So you can see you are quite dramatically changing the look of the Bugout, where it's going from a basic, very utilitarian FRN knife to a knife that looks a lot more futuristic, a lot more sleek. Frankly, you can get this same sort of groovy design in G10. You can get it in micarta, but certainly based on what you see online and things like that, titanium and carbon fiber seem to be the favored materials. This exact set of scales here with this finish will set you back around $100. Flytanium is one of those companies that quite often has various deals floating around and things like that. So you can sometimes get this for a little bit less, sometimes you'll pay a little bit more, but honestly you're in the realm of $100 for this. So this whole knife, if you look at fully loaded costs, is retail about a $275, $280 knife now, which is relatively expensive. The reason that you would get these scales is really threefold. These scales do three things for the knife. First off, they obviously change the look dramatically. Especially with, when you got a full satin build like this, your satin blade, your satin hardware, stuff like that. It just makes it look and feel a lot more sleek, a lot more premium. And as you look closely, you can see the milling on these scales is quite impressive. Let me fold up the blade so we can look a little closer. You can see there's a contour on this whole section here. The whole scale is contoured, and a pretty aggressive contour at that. So there's a contour all the way down here. You've got what is a contour with some intentional milling lines up at the front here, which is a nice little pinch point right there. You've got increased axis lock access. They took a divot out of here, so there's tons and tons of space for you to access that axis lock. That's a bit of a tongue twister. You got the same really cool grooved pattern. They expand them back here. There's a big stripe across the back, and that does give you a bit of texture. And then they condense them right here. You can still see if you look closely, those grooves are all still there. They're just really close to one another, those micro milling lines. And then you've got this full flat here, which is entirely contoured. Very nice chamfer all the way around the edge. You can see that contour there in the varying thickness across the bottom of the scale here. The fact is, the level of machining, and these are made in China. Flytanium has started making scales in the US, but these Bugout scales are still made in China. The level of manufacturing on these scales is very high, and honestly, they just look really pretty. So that's frankly the top reason that I think most people are upgrading the scales on their Bugout is they just like the look. They want it to look cooler, and frankly, you're going for a very different aesthetic than the utilitarian aesthetic of the Bugout, but this gives you a very different aesthetic, an aesthetic that I think most people are going to say is a lot cooler, is a lot more interesting, especially considering you can get these scales in a lot of different colors, in a lot of different andization patterns. One of the cool things that Flytanium does now is they've got their Modify system, which basically anything titanium, they've got a whole bunch of stock anodizing colors, and you can apply any of those anodizing colors to anything that you buy from them. This andization is done really, really well. This is a two-tone andization, where basically it's a bronze. You can see the sort of hints of bronze, especially at the edges here. It's a bronze andization, and then a sort of ice blue or a light blue andization, and there's a bit of a stone wash in the middle that gives you that two-tone andization finish. It's not the same thing as like a blurple, as something that is like a gradient anodization or two colors. It's two anodizations with a particular, treatment in the middle that brings out one of them underneath the other. Frankly, it's the sort of thing that until recently you mostly saw with companies like Grimsmo and things like that. Jens Onso does some really beautiful finishes like this. But the fact that Flytanium is allowing folks to get these more complex anodization patterns, these more complex colors on their Bugout or on any of the knives that Flytanium offers titanium scales for, is really cool, because honestly it does look and feel super premium. And this knife looks and feels a lot nicer than the base Bugout. Frankly, if you were just looking at them and honestly just feeling it in the hand, and you told me which feels like a better value, if I had to buy both of them at table, this for $270 versus this for $180, I think a lot of people are going to say that this feels like a more than $100 more premium knife. The other big difference that you get with Flytanium scales is you get, and of course it screws up as soon as I try to show that, but you get a more reliably better action. I intentionally have this run a little tight because I like my Bugouts a little tight. But if you were to run this a little looser, you would get that drop shutty action. And what you get with these stiffer titanium scales is you get a very smooth action throughout the entire opening and closing. And especially when you oil it up a little bit more, this thing is running pretty dry right now. Simply, it's a more premium feeling, more consistent action. One of the things that Flytanium would tout in sort of the early days that they were doing Bugout scales, because they've been doing these scales in various forms for years, one of the things you see on their marketing is improves the action of your Bugout. And it certainly does. And most importantly, it will generally get rid of any play. When this axis bar housing, all the guts in here, all the stuff that's around this axis lock and the little cage that goes out to there, when that is housed in these stiffer titanium frames, it is just, everything is more square, everything just moves nicer, and you get both a better action and you start to see that play go away, where it's certainly much easier to get the combination of that smooth action or even a drop shutty action without play, which is something that used to be impossible pretty much in older Bugouts, and it's something that still is inconsistent with even like newer stock Bugouts. Like this one right here, right now I can feel a tiny bit of play starting to develop. Right now it's very tiny, almost imperceptible. I wouldn't consider it an issue, but it's sort of typical for a current Benchmade, which is much improved from where they used to be, but it's still there. So the second thing you get for these scales is you get improved action. The third thing, and the thing that is frankly most surprising in how different it is to me, is you get a very different ergonomic feel when you do this to your Bugout. The first big difference is that it becomes a much more handle-heavy knife, which does lead to a very different feel. And honestly, it becomes a much more heavy knife in general. This adds probably about an ounce, maybe an ounce and a half to the stock Bugout, which is, granted, a very, very light knife. A lot of people don't like that this thing is so light that people say it feels like a toy or it feels cheap because of how light it is. Obviously, lightness was the goal. That was one of the primary design constraints in making the Bugout, so that's like saying that, be a man of water for being wet. But anyway, if you don't like a light-feeling knife, these titanium scales add quite a bit of heft to the Bugout. And the combination of that heft and making it a little bit more handle-heavy does make this feel like more of a heavy-duty knife. It makes it feel like something that you can push a little bit harder, that you can, drag through crap a little bit more. And the fact is, and I said this in my Bugout review, go over to Dutch Bushcraft, I think that's their name, DBK. their review of the Bugout, which they did with one of the aluminum handle ones. This is an objectively tough knife. You can baton with this, you can do all sorts of dumb stuff with a Bugout, and it will hold up. The blade will hold up, the axis lock will hold up, the pivot will hold up. You can do really heavy-duty, tough, buffoonish stuff with your Bugout, and it will hold up. It's just this one doesn't feel like it. It deceptively doesn't feel like it. This one feels like it. This feels super tough, and so a lot of people are going to be comfortable pushing their Bugout harder. It's a purely sort of psychosomatic thing, but they're going to feel more comfortable pushing their Bugout harder when it's got scales like this than they would have the normal Bugout, even though all the important parts are pretty much the same. But the subtle changes that Flytanium has made to the ergonomic lines do improve the ergonomics, particularly under those harder use tasks. One of the criticisms, I'm generally quite favorable to the Bugout's ergonomics and handle design, especially given that it's meant to be an everyman knife. But because it is so neutral, when you do start to push it, it's just there's not really enough to keep your hand in place here, and it can be one of those knives that either starts to get squirrely in your hand or that you really feel like you have to grip down on it to keep it in your hand. This knife, which by the way, if you look at it down the profile, is also a little bit fatter at its fattest points, actually a good bit fatter at its fattest points than the Bugout. Having that extra thickness, especially with this nice contour here, it fills the hand much more. You've got this little bit of grip here. You've got now bigger flats across the back, a nice big flat across the bottom, especially in this front finger index, and especially this front finger index here with this big flat rolling onto this nice contour. This feels very nice and secure in the hand. I don't even matter that much that this is a slick surface, that the surface finish is giving me absolutely nothing in terms of grip, because this ergonomic channel here in particular, and then of course the contouring you're getting back here, it's very easy to roll this into my knuckles, roll this into my palm, and feel like I have a ton of control over this knife even as I push it a little harder. And so the ergonomics on this Flytanium Bugout still is just as easy to grip up on the knife here, to pinch it right there, to use this anchor point right there, to grab it a little further back. It's still a very versatile, relatively neutral handle design. But the fact they made it a bit thicker, the fact they made it a bit heavier, the fact that they did add this more aggressive contour throughout, and that there are these bigger flats on the top, bigger flats on the bottom, the ergonomic experience with these Flytanium scales is absolutely improved relative to the baseline Bugout. And that would be true even if you got the cheaper versions of these, meaning the G10 scales or the micarta scales. If you just want to sort of get those ergonomic improvements, but you don't want to go all the way to titanium, or you want to keep it light, those are really good options as well. And everything that I just said here, except for the difference in weight, is going to apply just as much for those lighter and cheaper scale materials. And so overall, when I look at these titanium scales for the Benchmade Bugout, especially for anybody that's already in the knife enthusiast community, and that means if you are the sort of person that is used to paying $250, $300 for knives, and so you wouldn't blink at paying $275 for a Benchmade Bugout or paying $275 for a 3-inch EDC knife, these scales are a really compelling option. And I am honestly surprised at how much they improve the overall experience of the Bugout. By tightening up the action, by improving the ergonomics and the hand feel, by increasing the weight, but just enough that it feels satisfying. It's still a relatively lightweight knife. And then by bringing this beautiful fit and finish, And especially now that Flytanium has made these really nice andization patterns that they have accessible, and you've got all sorts of colors. You know, you can get golds, bronzes, pinks, teals, in all sorts of different combinations. They even put out these sort of maker's choice finishes every single month, where you can get, you know, your confetti and your entropic finishes and all that sort of wild stuff if you want it. And then they got some really fancy schmancy carbon fibers in there too. These, if you like the Bugout, or if you don't like the Bugout, but the main reasons that you like it, that you don't like it, are that you either are frustrated by the blade play, or you think it's too light and feels dinky, or you just don't like the ergonomics because they're too neutral for you. If you're in any of those 4 groups, these Flytanium scales are actually really easy to recommend. And I do think that even looking at a full retail, this Bugout at $275 with reliably without blade play, with a really cool finish, with a really cool handle, and with these improved ergonomics, I think that this Bugout is, for knife people, a more compelling knife than the standard Bugout. And I think that most people are going to be served well by getting this or another set of aftermarket scales. I'm going to be reviewing one other right after this one. So really, it does come down to a question of how you plan to use your Bugout. Is a Bugout for you kind of like a half step up from a Milwaukee Fastback? Is it purely a tool, something you have no affection for, something you just want to throw around and beat up and you don't care if it looks nice or feels nice? You just want to do a job, or frankly, if you're just not a knife person and you purely see knives as tools and you just don't care about how fancy or how nice your knife is or anything like that, stick with the baseline Bugout. You know, save yourself the $100. This isn't going to bring you that much utility. Or if there's things that you like about the Bugout, and one of those issues, whether it's the play or whether it's the ergonomics, is really a fly in the ointment for you, then get these in G10 or micarta. It's $50, $60, something like that, and you will still get that better action. You will still get those better ergonomics. But frankly, if you're the sort of average person who's watching my channel, which by now, you know, you are probably somebody who has at least toyed with the idea of spending $300 on a knife, if not outright done it. And frankly, I'm sure plenty of you have spent much, much more. These scales are really easy to recommend, and I do think that they improve the overall experience of the Bugout, not just visually, but overall, and they do, in fact, make it a better knife, and a meaningfully better knife. Flytanium's been making these scales for quite a while. They have surely sold a ton of them. And when a lot of their designs have come and gone, they have kept this particular design trucking, and it's because it just simply is a really good design. It looks cool, but more importantly, it's well thought out ergonomically. It brings out the best of the Bugout's design, and it really just elevates the knife. So, highly recommendable, whether you have a Bugout or whether you're considering a Bugout and are not sure whether it's the right knife for you. Picture having some Flytanium scales on it, and I think you'll find a knife that you probably like a lot more. So those are my thoughts on the Flytanium titanium scales for the Benchmade Bugout, particularly in this beautiful blue and bronze Neptune finish. Hope you found that helpful or at least entertaining. If you enjoyed, please like, subscribe, anything like that. It will help the channel grow, and I do appreciate it. And, you know, drop a comment down below. Let me know if you've played around with these scales or similar scales. I do have one more review of Bugout scales coming up. I've got some Putman scales that I really like. That'll be right after this one. But if there are any other scale makers you'd like me to look into, I can see if I can get my hands on a pair. I have tried most of them in the past. I used to be one of those guys that had, you know, 8 different customized Bugouts. So I've owned Rockscale, I've owned Yates, I've owned RSD, Rips Garage Tech, all those. I've had all of those scales. Frankly, I've had multiple of a lot of them. So if there are reviews that people want, RC Blade Works, I've had them. If there are reviews people want of different scale manufacturers, do let me know and I'll try to make that work. Otherwise, hope you found this to be a good use of your time. Hope you have a great rest of your day. This has been Clark the Knife. Bye-bye now.